I prefer to remove the word executive and just focus on the concept that is most useful, which is presence. Have you ever left a meeting knowing that you had a stronger grasp of the problem, only to watch someone else walk away with the credit? And then you hear the advice that you need to speak up more. And if you're more reserved, you likely hear that advice even more often. But that advice is incomplete. You see, speaking up more can make you more visible because people notice you when you speak up more, but it does not necessarily mean that you are perceived as being ready for leadership. Why? Because visibility and presence are not the same thing. Visibility determines whether or not people have heard enough from you in order to notice your contribution. The presence determines what they conclude about you after they've noticed you. And until you understand that distinction, you might be chasing to have more airtime while you are strengthening the wrong impression. Let's talk about executive presence. People think of executive presence as this ancient universal law of leadership, but it was actually a very recent construct. It was popularized by the economist Sylvia Ann Hewlett in 2014, and her model organized executive presence around these three constructs. There was gravitas, communication, and appearance. And it caught on really quickly because it put a name to something that people were already observing, but it did cause significant problems. Problem number one, it is vague. The central idea of the model was gravitas, which is commonly used to describe something that is serious or a hard to define it factor. That's why many leaders who are told to develop more gravitas end up becoming more confused. And problem number two is what this vagueness puts into practice. When people cannot already clearly define what leadership readiness looks like, they tend to compare you with leaders that they already recognize. And the question becomes, does this person sound like a leader that I know? Or do they fit into an existing picture of what an executive looks like? And that's why a lot of advice around executive presence centers around appearances, personality, and conformity. And this puts the greatest burden on people who do not already resemble the people who currently hold the power. And that is why I prefer to remove the word executive and just focus on the concept that is most useful, which is presence. Presence is not a look or feel. It is not a personality type or an output on conformity. Presence is a read that other people conclude about your internal state. It is developed from the inside, internally, and then made perceptible by others on the outside, externally. It is a read on how they understand how you're likely going to function under higher pressures, higher stakes, whether or not you're going to function with a highly self-aware self-regulation or self-control, or whether you're going to function from a need for recognition. To build presence, you don't build it by training yourself to become an extrovert or dominate the conversation or training your vocals to sound more confident. In fact, those activities can often backfire. So moving forward, I'm going to share the action steps and provide more clarity around presence by speaking towards two layers. The first layer are the signals of presence, which are the behaviors that other people can observe. And then we'll move on to talk about the conditions that produce those signals. Your senior leaders cannot directly observe your self-regulation, your internal clarity, or your confidence. They can't observe those directly. Rather, they must infer them from your behaviors under both social and cognitive pressures. That's why building presence is not mysterious. Presence itself is not mysterious. It is built from signals. And once you understand these signals, you can build them deliberately. But first, we need to address one of the most common misconceptions about how leadership is recognized. The most common advice is to tell you to speak up more. Speaking up more does and it can increase your visibility, right? There are studies who showed that when there is a small group with no previously established leader inside that group, those individuals within that group who speak up more frequently are often more likely to be perceived as leaders. So it would be inaccurate to say that a greater volume of words spoken never matters, because it can. Right? A person who never contributes in a conversation cannot assume that somehow other people can somehow discover the quality of their thinking. Why? Because unexpressed capacity is very difficult to evaluate. But just because you speak up more often, it means you're going to get noticed, but it doesn't mean that they'll be able to interpret what they see. For example, It's possible to speak up and to be visible as someone who is a strategic thinker. But it's also possible to speak up and become visible as someone who over-explains things, someone who repeats other people's points of view, or someone who needs to fill the silence because silence makes them uncomfortable. You see, speaking up more is your output, and having greater spoken words as output and the meaning of that output are two different systems. And this is why forcing yourself to speak up more can often backfire in three ways. The first way it can backfire is when it increases your nervousness or self-consciousness because part of your attention is trapped in self-monitoring. Self-monitoring is kind of like the thoughts that go through your mind when you're wondering, did I say that right? How did I come across? What should I say next? What are they thinking of me? Right? So part of your attention, it's divided between the discussion at hand and your own performance. The second way that forcing yourself to speak up more can backfire is when you are speaking up more, but then there isn't the appropriate framing or substance behind it, and that can really decrease your credibility, right? Put it this way, a comment is not valuable just simply because it was spoken, right? And a third way that speaking up more can backfire is when you're speaking up more just for the sake of speaking up more, right? That can produce the opposite impression that you intended, right? For example, right, you intend to convey confidence, but speaking up more and forcing yourself to do so can convey the desperate need to be seen or recognized. And another example is that, well, you intend to convey deep knowledge, but then if you speak up more, that excessive detail can produce the opposite effect where it seems like you just cannot understand what the discussion really needs at hand. And instead of changing their perception, forcing yourself for greater volume of speech output, it just confirms their perception. If you force yourself to speak up more without changing the underlying signal that you're sending, it just makes the previous wrong impression of you even stronger. If you're listening to this and you resonate with even a part of it, then I invite you to work with me and my team. Every single week, we focus on that signal transmission. We focus on the internal changes, the personal growth and transformation. So if this is meaningful to you and you genuinely desire that for yourself and your life, then click the link below this video and I look forward to working with you on the inside. This now leads us to the actual signals themselves. The first signal is a controlled pace. Now that does not mean speak slowly. Right? A person who speaks slowly can appear uncertain or overly rehearsed. What controlled pace means is that you're the one that controls your own pace. You don't let the external circumstances or external pressures to control it for you. A controlled pace is really important because when you control your own pace, you're letting your listeners observe that you have available cognition. It's not caught up in self-monitoring. It's not caught up in attention divided, that you have cognitive space available to make significant decisions. The second signal is economy with completeness. This does not mean saying as little as possible. It's not about being concise. Right? Being concise does not mean you have authority, because authoritativeness does not come with just merely being brief. Right? Economy with completeness means that you're using no more language than the decision requires, but you're still providing enough context for other people to understand your reasoning. The third signal is composure under pressure. This does not mean you're suppressing all emotions or keeping private, personal life apart from professional life. It does not mean that. Right? It just means that your primary or your first emotional impulse does not then dictate your behavioral response. Right? So in other words, self-regulation of emotions, self-control, and then you choose your behavior. The fourth signal is decision level framing. So instead of providing and conveying more information, this is clarifying what that information means. And this is one of the strongest ways that you can convey your expertise and make your expertise more legible as leadership, because you're helping your leaders to organize around a consequential decision. The fifth signal is your ability to leave space. And this does not mean remembering to breathe and to pause. No, those are appearances. The space that I'm referring to is the balance between producing more sound and to be able to produce the signals that carry the qualities that senior leaders are trying to detect. right? So loudness is producing more sound. And loudness does matter, but by itself, loudness does not determine your range or your reach. Your range and your reach are determined by the nature of the signal that you output. Now let's talk about the conditions that generate those 5 signals. The first condition is competence. Let me offer you my definition of competence. Competence is genuine confidence in your ability to understand the condition, the situation, or the issue at hand, to be able to deliver value, and to be able to handle what happens next. You must develop genuine confidence in those things first. And when I'm talking about genuine confidence, I don't mean just appearing confident or changing your voice so it sounds confident. I mean genuine confidence from within. You develop that first, and then other people, when that output matches and provides evidence, then other people have that confidence in your abilities, then that's when you have competence. Competence reduces the need for a greater volume of speech output. When you truly have a deep knowledge matter expertise, you do not need to say everything you know to be able to prove that you know it. But instead, you can separate out what matters. You can actually answer the question that was asked. Like, I don't know how many times I've spoken with somebody, asked them a specific question, and then they went and they spoke for 10, 20 minutes about something entirely different, and they never answered the question in the first place, right? So competence allows you to answer the question that was asked. And finally, having competence allows you to acknowledge what you do not know without it feeling like a threat to your credibility. The second condition that produces the signals of presence is cognitive clarity. My definition of cognitive clarity is the discipline to be able to identify what matters, to be able to organize one's own thinking, and to be able to express a very unique perspective that other people can understand and act upon. It allows you to distinguish facts from opinions, central issues from distracting details. It allows you to recognize patterns within information and identify causes from symptoms. Cognitive clarity is what gives you the signal of economy with completeness. You are clear and concise because you have done the work ahead of time to separate signal from noise. The third condition that generates the signals of presence is internal authority. My definition is that internal authority is the grounded conviction that your value, your perspectives, and your contributions do not depend on another person's immediate agreement or approval. That does not mean that you're got to think that you're always right. No, but it does mean that you are open to better reasoning, that you are open to receiving correction, you are open to being engaged in constructive dissent, and you're open to different perspectives. In all my years of executive coaching, I have noticed that your ability and your sense of internal authority is most clearly observed when, number one, when you are conversing with someone and they disagree with you. That is when that really comes out. It's observable. Number two is when you are present and you are in discussions or conversing with someone more senior than you. And seniority could mean they're more senior in position, more senior in title, more senior in their experiences or in their level of intelligence around a certain area. And number three, it's really observable when you are in situations that people challenge your perspective. Right? That's really observable. Now, internal authority, that's exactly what produces for you your cognitive availability. Right? For example, when you are no longer preoccupied with having something to prove, or having something that you need to hide or suppress, or if you're not preoccupied with needing to protect, having something to protect, then your attention just becomes more available for greater scope. The fourth condition that generates the signals of presence is consequence readiness, which is the ability to act on wise discernment while remaining ready to accept the potential for disagreement, discomfort, rejection, or loss that might follow. A person who has consequence readiness recognizes that any sound, high-stakes decisions will have professional, emotional, and social costs. But they remain internally steady in anticipation of those costs, and they act with wise discernment rather than just avoiding consequences. And finally, the fifth condition for developing the signals of presence is orientation towards service, which is the habit of directing your attention so that your contributions serve the identified needs of the situation and the people involved, instead of your own needs of validation, control, and self-protection. You can think of it this way. In one orientation towards the self, you as a speaker, you are constantly managing yourself under the minds of other people, right? This is where you're wondering how you sound, how you look, what other people think of you. But in the other orientation towards service, this is where your focus is on advancing understanding, advancing discernment within complexity, and advancing useful action. Two different orientations, but one is orientation towards service. Now keep in mind that orientation through service does not mean compliance. It does not mean that you have to be self-sacrificing, always available and agreeable all the time. It also does not mean that you place other people's preferences ahead of truth or standard or long-term outcomes. But it does mean that sometimes you might have to hold someone accountable. You might have to articulate something that is unpopular, that you might be challenging a very common and convenient narrative. It might mean those things. Orientation through service changes how expertise is being used. Your expertise is now no longer evidence of your own personal importance, but instead it is a service towards making better decisions and therefore better outcomes, which means it may require that you make a decision that produces immediate dissatisfaction among a certain group of people. You can still value receiving credit for the work that you've done because you're not allowing your work to be repeatedly exploited. But it means that recognition is no longer the primary or immediate purpose of every contribution. Instead, your aim is now about creating value. And as a result of that, your communication just becomes more precise and more influential, and it carries more weight, which is gravitas. Right. And finally, orientation towards service. It does not mean that you're thinking less of yourself. It means that you're becoming less preoccupied with yourself so that more of your capability and your capacities can become available for what leadership requires. If you want to receive another deep dive from a different angle and a different one of my perspectives about executive presence, check out this previous video that I did.